Hello, everyone. Mr. J. Kind of a fun lesson here with all of the talk about World War III, internal, external conflict, the promise of heightened tensions, world affairs, and everybody living at the edge of their seat. Let's look back in history a little bit and see what time was like in an era similar to the one we're living through today, and see what the perspective was like for the people living through that day and that time, and then why it was as such. And the time I want to cruise back to is the pre World War II era in the United States. And I would like to look at this for two reasons. One would be the time frame and the history of the circumstances surrounding the pre-World War II beginnings and American entry then into that war. And then the second would be the way that history is told, and for what purpose is it told in such a way. We've all heard the adage that the winners get to tell the story of history. This is true. Largely, this is. But it doesn't mean we should look at the cases of the people that have lost in history and try to understand that point of view as well. We want to understand and broaden our perspective on the world. So, if history is written by the winners, then the winners also write the history textbooks. And how history is told is a big marker of a culture and a civilization. And we've heard about textbook bias before, so I would love to dive into this little bias, one that I had isolated a long time ago, shared with my students over the years, and here we go. Congress is legislating neutrality. I'll just read from the book. You can see highlighted on the screen terms that I've already pre-highlighted for you, and talk about the characters involved as we read along and try to identify this textbook bias and why it may be presented in this way. As the gloomy 1930s lengthened, an avalanche of lurid articles and books condemning the munitions manufacturers as war fomenting merchants of death poured from American presses. A Senate committee headed by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota was appointed in 1934 to investigate the blood business. So his picture right here is Gerald Nye, that senator from North Dakota. He happened to be a Republican, but was an outspoken critic of any getting involved in any conflict, largely because of an investigation that was led by the Senate and Gerald Nye in a committee, much like you see Jim Jordan maybe today leading one of those committee hearings and investigating our entry and participation into World War I. Now, what Gerald Nye had found out is that largely we got involved in World War I for economic reasons and to bail out Britain and France from the tremendous war debt that they were incurring. And really, what was discovered in there, let's read on and find out. By sensationalizing evidence, which sounds kind of interesting, it's evidence, regarding America's entry into World War I, the senatorial probers tended to shift the blame away from the German submarines onto the American bankers and arms manufacturers. Because the munitions makers had obviously made money out of the war, many a naive citizen leaped to the illogical conclusion that these soulless scavengers had caused the war in order to make money. So, this is a huge one, right? Everybody, if you can't see it right now, you need to read more of anything. Because to identify the author's bias, and this is an American history textbook here, is really critical. First of all, you can't sensationalize evidence. It's evidence. Can you sensationalize it? Can you extend it? I suppose. But sensationalizing means adjectives. So, largely, evidence is evidence, and it is speaking and being reported on. Okay. And that evidence suggested that and proved that American bankers and manufacturers of weapons made a lot of money during World War I. So, what the Congress was hoping to find out was that information. It did its job. It found out the information. Thank you, Gerald Nye, one of my favorite people in American history. But many a naive citizen leaped to the illogical conclusion that money is a big part of why we fought World War I. But the trouble is that is not a naive conclusion, nor is it illogical. It's 100% the opposite of both of those things. So, this kind of reasoning suggested that if the profits could only be removed from the arms traffic, one hell of a business, the country could steer clear of any world conflict that might erupt in the future. So if you feel like it, go study the sinking of the Lusitania, for example, a transport vessel that had a passenger ship that was loaded with munitions headed to England via the United States in 1915, sunk by the Germans because largely it was carrying arms. That would often happen between the United States and the Allied powers, is they would fly neutral ships, hoping the Germans would avoid sinking those ships. They would fly neutral countries' flags, of with which at the time the United States was. So, my gosh, lots of information here, folks. But if you don't know it, maybe the book can teach you. But it can't, or it doesn't do a very thorough job. And we're only in paragraph 1 here. Okay. Let's take a look at paragraph 2. Responding to overwhelming popular pressure, Congress made haste to legislate the nation out of a war. Congress overwhelmed to popular pressure. What is Congress's job and who are they to represent? Oh, that's right. Article 1 says, we the people. So we the people pressured Congress to pass a law, and they did it. It's crazy. But according to this author, that's a bad thing. Action was spurred by the danger that Mussolini's Ethiopian assault would plunge the world into a new bloodbath. The Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, and 37, taken together, stipulated that when the president proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, certain restrictions would automatically go into effect. No American could legally sail on a belligerent ship, sell or transport munitions to a belligerent, or make loans to a belligerent. So, if two nations are at war, the United States does not want to send its people there on ships belonging to belligerent nations. They don't want to sell weapons to any side, and they don't want our country to make loans to any side. It sounds like a logical way to stay out of a foreign conflict. And guess what? It is. The American people responded to logic after World War I in a Gerald Nye committee investigation and passed neutrality legislation. Maybe we learned our lesson, but let's see what the author has to say. This head in the sand legislation. So you have your head in the sand. You are a citizen that is naive and illogical, and you have a silly Congress that overwhelmingly responds to popular pressure quickly. And your head is in the sand. It marked an abandonment of the traditional policy of freedom of the seas, a policy for which America had professedly fought 2 full-fledged wars, and those 2 full-fledged wars would have been the War of 1812 and World War I itself. and several undeclared wars. That would have been the quasi war with France and the Barbary Coast Wars of the Jefferson era, fought in a defense of the concept of freedom of the seas. But does freedom of the seas, folks, mean selling weapons to nations at war? That's what the debate is all about in Ukraine. But we're not even selling them sometimes. We're giving them to them. Or we're giving them the billions of dollars to buy them from our own companies. The Neutrality Acts were specifically tailored to keep the nation out of a conflict like World War I. If they had been in effect at that time, America probably would not have been sucked in, at least not in April 1917. Congress was one war too late with its legislation. What had seemed dishonorable to Wilson seemed honorable and desirable to a later disillusioned generation. So, naive and illogical, heads in the sand, you're disillusioned. Storm cellar, now you live in the basement. Storm cellar neutrality proved to be tragically short-sighted. Now your head is in the basement. You're disillusioned. You can't even see. This is probably my favorite one. America falsely assumed that the decision for peace or war lay in its own hands. This is the textbook instructing American students that the decision for peace or war is not in the hands of the U.S. Congress, which is the direct representative of the people. Why would they say that? Good question. Not in those of the satanic forces already unleashed in the world. All right. Satanic. It's an interesting word choice. We'll hold that thought for a while before we get into some more history. Prisoner of its own fears, meaning now we're in jail in the basement, short-sightedly, disillusioned, naive, and illogical, and our head is in the sand. Okay? It failed to recognize that it might have used its enormous power to shape international events. This is the same textbook that says when the United States would use its overwhelming power to shape international events like the Vietnam War or Iraq and Afghanistan, or any war that the authors that write the book choose to disagree with at the time. These are the layers that should get you to question things. Oh, we used our enormous power, didn't we also, to expand westward and conquer the Indians? I wonder what the textbook said about that. What about Hawaii and the Philippines? Did we use our enormous power to shape international events? Was it okay then, but not okay in the 30s? Was it not okay in the 30s, but okay then? Is your head spinning? Okay. I would ask my students to find out what was going to set me off every time we would read this year after year. If they could figure it out, they would be, I would consider them a pretty sharp reader. But very rarely are students able to extract the direct bias in a textbook. Why? Because they trust what they're being told. Does everybody still trust what you're being told? Statutory neutrality. Oh, let me finish up that last sentence. Instead, it remained at the mercy of events controlled by the dictators. Last paragraph. Statutory neutrality, though of undoubted legality, was of dubious morality. Well, you should know that already because you're in prison and you're in the basement with your head in a hole and you can't see. Like you didn't know you were immoral already. America served notice that it would make no distinction whatever between brutal aggressors and innocent victims. By striving to hold the scales even, it actually overbalanced them in favor of the dictators who had armed themselves to the teeth. By declining to use its vast industrial strength to aid its democratic friends and defeat its totalitarian foes, it helped goad the aggressors along their blood-spattered path of conquest. Okay. Hey, that's a tough one, everybody. But I hope you enjoyed that quick analysis. I don't even know if it's quick, but if you look at an overview of how history is being told by and from the point of view of the winners, and you realize that the story of history is probably more complicated than that on many levels. If we think about what we are living through right now today, in the last 125 years, the United States has already been through World War I, World War II, the Cold War, including the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and several other proxy wars, the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. We have been living as a nation going to war the entire 20th century. And who has benefited from all of this? Who benefits the most from all of these wars? That is the question. And the question should be answered. Those that profit from war reap the largest benefits. So clearly, those are not the peoples of any of the nations involved. They're the leaders, and they are the leadership class, which includes those in charge of finance and those in charge of the money system. And let's not forget, ladies and gentlemen, the United States government sacrificed its power to control currency in 1913, and they gave it to a private bank, which was largely owned by foreigners, including the Rothschilds. So let's remember that our fiscal sovereignty was now 100% out of our hands. Yet at the same time that the United States created the Federal Reserve System, it also implemented an income tax. So the ability to create flexible currency, which allows for the mass printing and loaning of money to the government to buy or finance anything it wants to do, which largely includes interfering in foreign relations. There is reasons that the United States did not want to have any permanent alliances when George Washington and the Founding Fathers created the Republic. The reason you want to avoid entangling alliances is for the very reason we are having this talk today. Now we're talking about expanding NATO beyond. Finland was just added. Now Ukraine, and let's not forget, everybody, why is NATO created in the first place? To check Soviet expansion. Soviet expansion at that time, however, already included the Ukraine. So not that one is more legitimate than the other. This is not to say that, but to not understand the variables of all of the bigger pieces of the equation and to not entertain complexity in a discussion and to not know these things, but to fly a Ukrainian flag on your car in blind obedience to what you're being told by the masters of the world, that requires a second look. Because I don't know about anybody else, but I do not want to fight in World War III, nor do I want my son or daughter to fight in World War III, nor do I want them drafted, nor do I want to pay for a World War III. We, the people, have accepted our government keeping secrets from us on purpose since the end of World War II. We've allowed that. We've knowingly accepted that it's okay that they don't tell us the truth on things. That includes a lot of things now. And a lot of people are having a very difficult time realizing the depth of the lies and the depth of the manipulation. And yet many of my international students that I teach come to class every day eager to ask the same questions that my American students always would ask. But you're just not allowed to answer them anymore in our beloved country. So I will continue to ask questions and try to avoid conflict in World War III. I will try to identify great American heroes like Senator Gerald Nye from North Dakota, the author and creator, really, of the American isolationist movement, the man with the evidence that he presented, not sensationalized, that helped the American people understand what laws we should pass to try to avoid the same mistake that we did. Now, if you found this at all interesting, you might find Pearl Harbor's discussion just as interesting. You might find other major events that get the United States into every conflict. You might find the events that surround those circumstances really much more complicated than you were ever taught. That's all. Take care, everybody. Have a good one.